So my name is Anne. I am Quinkit. I'm a member of the Colonialism First Nation, which is in Whitehorse, Yukon. I grew up on Treaty 7 territory in Alberta, Canada. So my family is descendant from the first peoples of the Yukon territory in Alaska, but my dad's part of the family is also from Europe. So I've got settler ancestors, and I also have Indigenous ancestors, and so thinking about settler colonialism for me is about thinking about my position on the territory that I live on. And I think that it's always important to think about as Indigenous people and as settler folks and other people who have been brought to this place, sometimes forcefully, sometimes not consensually, to think about the land that we're on right now. So we've had some acknowledgement of that, and I wanted to make sure that that's something that we're all thinking about as we are in this space. I teach settler colonialism to students, and I'm in the anthropology program at the Community Graduate Center, and so I teach out at Queen's College, and I've been engaged in thinking about how to teach complex issues like settler colonialism, complex structures to undergrads at the very first, usually they're in their first or second semesters of college education. So the theory of settler colonialism, the reason that we go to this sort of analytic space to think about settler colonialism as a term that we're using to describe it, is because those of us who are Indigenous in spaces of siege, and as we've seen in this last presentation here, people out at Standing Rock right now are fighting for survival. They're fighting for the water. They're fighting for survival as people, okay, and as peoples who are Indigenous to that territory and have been living in and with the land and the water for thousands of years. And we've not just been fighting for survival in this generation. Our parents were fighting for survival. Our grandparents were fighting for survival. Our great-grandparents were fighting for survival. We've been dealing with the theft of children in residential and boarding schools. We've been dealing with the contamination of the land and water. We've been dealing with actual massacres, as we saw with Ladonna's introduction in the video. Settler colonialism comes in many forms. Okay, so there are multiple ways that people are experiencing these forms of oppression. And so talking about that as settler colonialism is a way of trying to figure out how all of those things are connected. How is the theft of children connected to the contamination of the water? Okay. How is the policing of communities and the poverty of reserves connected to the carceral system, the prison system, where people are sort of ridiculously overrepresented? So we're trying to make connections between these different things. So theorists who are thinking about settler colonialism and anthropology and native studies and settler colonial studies, which is now its own thing as well, are finding ways to try and articulate what are the connections between those different forms of oppression, and how do we figure out how that experience is shaped for people who are Indigenous, and also how do we figure out how to intervene in that structure. So when I talk about settler colonialism, I talk about it as having three basic facets. Okay, one is that it's a slightly different move than kind of regular colonialism. So we can think about that in historical terms. We think about colonialism as a colonial power coming to a space, extracting wealth and resources, and then taking it back to the metropole. Okay, so that we think about Britain doing that in this continent in the early sort of conquest. There's a transition that happens from that form of colonialism to a move that is about settling and taking land. Okay, so that's where that form of colonialism turns into something that we start to call settler colonialism. And there's not a clear break between those two movements historically. So we can see them happening and overlapping and intersecting in all sorts of ways. But the thing about settler colonialism is that the settlers come to stay. And they come to stay, and they are on the territory and taking the territory. So settler colonialism is something that is about land. So that's the first facet. Second facet is that settler colonialism destroys to replace. So there's a destructive power to the machine that is settler colonialism that is not only destruction for the sake of destruction, it's destruction to replace what was there with something else. And so when we think about that in the terms of the Dakota Access Pipeline, we can start to think about what are those things? What is being destroyed in the first part? And then what is meant to replace it? And then we have a way into thinking about how do we disrupt that? What's the narrative about what is the replacing power here? So you hear when you look at the Morton County Sheriff's Office, when you look at the language that the pipeline company itself is using about energy networks, about getting access, getting this oil into other markets, you start to hear language around the future and safety and security and prosperity and wealth of the United States, right? So that's the language that's about the sort of futurity of the United States of America and its citizens. And what's crucial about that is that you realize that that is a future that's built on the destruction of indigenous people. And that's what the language of settler colonialism helps us to see, that that is about destroying a thing in order to replace it with something else. The third aspect of settler colonialism that our sort of lovely colleague, Miss Patrick Wolf, coined as the phrase that sort of circulates around settler colonialism is that it's a structure and not an event. And so it's really important to remember that even though we can trace the history of settler colonialism and the way that settlement actually happened, that it's a structure that continues. I don't need light this time. It's a structure that continues to form and shape people's lives in the present. So there's nothing past about settler colonialism. It's happening to people today. It's happening to people in this city. It's happening to people out at Standing Rock. It's something that people experience, that structure, and they come up against it in the present. Okay, so it's not something that's ancient history. So thinking about that structure, something that's continuing in people's lives, is also a really important piece of it. Okay, and I have how my time?
You have 8 more minutes.
Okay. Okay, so when we think about it as a structure, I think that's it's really useful to think about that structure because it helps us to think about how it's not just past but continuing and how people are experiencing settler colonialism in the present. The language of structure has some challenges though, and I want us I'm going to ask for a couple of volunteers, and maybe some of the people who are at the very front, and maybe need like 4 volunteers. Yeah? No, you're pointing at someone else. All right, so you got to make your way to the front if you want to be a volunteer. So, all right. Okay, cool. Okay, are you going to be an auto too? All right. Okay, so I want you to make, with the 3 of you together, like a house with your bodies. Yeah? Okay, so I apologize for this in advance, but you're settler colonialism. So we're thinking about this as a structure, okay? So the structure of settler colonialism, we have an internal framework, right? We could imagine putting drywall, right? We're going to put up the house, we're going to paint it pretty colors. We've got this structure internally. With the paints and the drywall and everything over top of it, you might not see the structure inside. And that's one of the ways that settler colonialism functions. We don't see the internal articulations of how it's put together. There are all sorts of ways of making this look like something it's not. And so when we talk about reconciliation and all these nice words around sort of moving forward with indigenous state relations, often that's a new coat of paint, but the structure inside is not changed. But if you take off the facade, right, you realize that the structure is actually made of relationships between people and connections between people. And what needs fundamental reorganizing are those connections. Okay, because what is happening here is that the connections between people are deeply unequal. The connection to the land is deeply unequal. The whole thing is built on a foundation of theft of land and slavery, right? So we need to think about how to rework those connections. So there are ways of sort of concretizing the connections. So the language that circulates around land as property is one of the things that makes that foundation really hard to crack, right? Relationships of economic relationships of capitalism make the connections between people really hard to shift. Some people have an easier time moving within the structure than others. And so one of the things we need to think about is how do we completely reorganize this? I would like to look less like a house and more like a teepee. How do we actually work with the relationships between each other and between ourselves and the land in order to move towards decolonization? Okay, let me stop being that. Thank you. So the next thing to think about when teaching settler colonialism is that it's about remaking relationships. So if we think of dealing with settler colonialism on those terms, it's about how do we personally rework the relationships we have with Indigenous people, with the land that we live and work on, in order to find a more equitable way of being with each other and with the land. A real danger when talking about settler colonialism, especially in undergraduate classes, is that it can start a sort of chain reaction of defensiveness and guilt. When we talk about people as being settlers, it can sometimes be come up against a brick wall, right? People they get really defensive about it. So one of the really important things to think about when we think about categories like settler and Indigenous is that when we think about being a settler, which means being a descendant of people who were settling this territory, and continually benefiting from this structure, right? Being a settler is a structural position and not an identity. Okay, and that's absolutely crucial to be able to communicate with other people. That it's not about identifying as a settler and therefore feeling guilty about that. It's not about some sort of like internally always sort of guilty countenance that you have to have when you're in your interactions with Indigenous people. It's a structural position that you happen to occupy. Okay, and the thing about being in that position is that people move through it at different times. I, because of white privilege, moved through a position of being treated like a settler in different situations. It's not something that is an identity for me or for anybody. If it is, you should stop. But the thing about moving from that as a position is that it's about recognizing the benefits that accrue to you by being in that position, not of your own accord. It doesn't matter what your intent is, right? So you end up in that position. How do you rearrange those relationships so that you no longer benefit from that system, a system that is built on death and oppression? Okay, so how do you make a different sort of set of relationships with people so that that's not the case? I think that's the fundamental question we need to be thinking about when we think about theorizing settler colonialism and also the way that we engage with movements that are happening, like the one at Standing Rock, is look at the work that people are already doing to dismantle that structure. Like the work is already happening on the ground. You can look at the kinds of relationships that people are forming out at Standing Rock. People experience that space as a space of healing, of deep healing. That's already sort of dismantling and rebuilding something. And I think we need to see that as both actual physical material labor, but also theoretical work. So we can look at that and say, what is this work about dismantling? What is it building? How is it reworking relationships with the earth and with the land and the water and each other? And use that to push back against this structure, which looks solid from the outside, but is really a whole bunch of moving parts. And sometimes it doesn't take a whole lot to push it over. And so I want us to encourage us to keep thinking about how we can do that in both theoretical terms and by getting ourselves on the ground as well and engaging directly in these movements.